As we noted in our first session together, the myth of the medieval law merchant has not only influenced our understanding of private ordering, but has also had a profound effect on the development of modern commercial law. In the United States, the Uniform Commercial Code, the statute that governs the sale of goods, provides that the code is in large part a reformulation and restatement of the law merchant, which transcends state and even national boundaries. The U.S. isn't alone. Commercial laws the world over direct courts deciding contract disputes to look to customs and usages for a variety of purposes, among them gap-filling, interpretation, and fleshing out the meaning of the duties of good faith and reasonableness. Now, if these few usages do not in fact exist, these laws will have the effect of sending courts on what amounts to a mere wild goose chase, and will compel them to employ what amounts to little more than a legal fiction to decide commercial cases. While many of these laws were at least partially justified by reference to the now debunked law merchant story, the mere fact that transnational usages of trade relating to sales law did not exist in the Middle Ages doesn't necessarily mean that customs and usages of trade do not exist in more modern merchant communities. After all, both commerce and the cost of communication have changed dramatically since the Middle Ages. To explore the possibility that unwritten customs and usages that are geographically coextensive with the extent of trade might be more prevalent in modern times, I will share with you some highlights from my empirical projects that were designed to explore whether these types of usages assumed by modern commercial law statutes actually exist. In the main, my findings parallel those of Cadon's studies of the Middle Ages. The studies did identify a few highly local or especially salient practices, like hay cannot smell foul or be wet. Yet in the main, they cast considerable doubt on the claim that pervasive sets of unwritten usages exist in merchant communities. Before delving into the evidence, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. These studies do not purport to disprove the existence of usages in the social scientific sense of disprove. Nevertheless, in thinking about whether the evidence presented is sufficient to prompt a very serious reconsideration of the role that trade usage plays in commercial law systems, it's important to keep in mind that the policymakers and academics who continue to advocate for courts looking to usages have not put forth not any systematic empirical evidence to suggest that such usages exist. Rather, they rely solely on our old friend, the law merchant story from the Middle Ages, and a handful of ad hoc examples that, carefully examined, do not even support their claims. So, with this background on the table, let's turn to the studies I conducted. My studies take at their starting point the one thing that modern scholars writing about customs and usages agree on, namely that they are most likely to arise and endure in situations where transactors interact on a repeat basis over a long period of time in relatively similar transactions. Starting from this premise, I identified 4 merchant industries that at the turn of the 20th century were characterized by these conditions. They were hay, grain and feed, textiles, and silk. Trade associations in all of these industries had created association-run arbitration tribunals to resolve contract disputes among industry participants. And after operating their tribunals for a while, all concluded that it would be useful to codify their industry's customs and practices into written trading rules that could be used to govern transactions and resolve disputes in their private legal systems. Although the associations had expected the codification process to be quick and easy, it turned out instead to be both time-consuming and contentious. Debate over the textile rules, for example, took 18 years, while the rules for raw silk took 6 years. In all of the codification efforts studied, it quickly became clear that there was not, in fact, widespread agreement about the meaning of widely used trade terms or the content of customary practices. To get a sense of just how basic and pervasive these disagreements were, let's turn for a moment to the hay industry. As the codification process got underway, it soon became clear that the haymen, as they called themselves, could not even agree on the definition of a term as basic as bale of hay. As one transactor explained, the large bales of New York and New England mean a different bale from the large bale in the western states, and the same is true of small bales. Even within particular cities, consensus could not be reached. As one transactor noted, in Chicago at present, there is a lack of clear definition of small bales. Additional confusion arose when some transactors jumped into this debate, claiming that whether or not something was a bale was to be determined by its size, while others jumped in and maintained it was to be determined by its weight. Very similar problems arose when the Rules Committee attempted to draft a rule relating to when certain freight charges had to be requested. One transactor proposed a rule requiring them to be requested within a reasonable time, a term American law would look to usage to define. But this suggestion provoked widespread ridicule and even widespread disagreement. As one participant in the debate opined, that reasonable time business will not tell you anything. You might as well leave it out. And when a merchant then suggested that a more definite rule should be adopted, proposals from the floor ranged from 15 days to 9 months. More generally, as one of the Hay Association's annual reports concluded, prior to the adoption of the written trading rules, there were no established customs to govern, and every transaction was typical of the parties engaged in it. A similar sentiment was expressed in the grain trade. As one transactor observed, there are customs in the grain trade that are supposed to be established, but the trouble in respect to them is they are not fixed and are not understood alike. Even in the exceptionally close-knit New York textile industry that was concentrated in a 3-city block radius, after 18 years of deliberation, merchants were unable to reach a consensus about the meaning of even widely used terms like first quality or second quality goods. And when the textile rules were finally adopted, they contained different sets of rules for different industry segments, since industry-wide agreement could not be reached. Yet even with such a tailored codification, it took another 20 years before disputes over the meaning of even those terms defined in the trading rules began to abate. In sum, in all of the industries studied, despite the truly valiant efforts of the trade rules drafters, disagreements about the content of commercial usages ran so deep that some practices had to be left uncodified for decades because a consensus simply could not be reached. In the end, in all of the industries I studied, the trade rules codification debates shifted from codification to something closer to a quasi-legislative process, a process in which alleged usages were one of many inputs into the development of the rules. As the preamble to the rules of the American Fats and Oils Association states, the objective of the rules is to work towards uniformity and certainty in the customs and usages of trade, while the preamble to the American Seed Trade Association rules explains they were designed to assist in the promulgation of trade rules, practices, and customs for those engaged in the industry. Together, these case studies of merchant communities suggest that unwritten usages of trade that were geographically coincident with the extent of trade simply did not exist in the manner assumed by American or other countries' commercial laws. This finding was not particularly surprising because in the mid-century hearings before the New York Law Reform Commission on the proposed commercial code, the Commerce and Industry Association of New York expressed its opposition to the code's reliance on trade usages, explaining that the customs, usages, and practices of business are far from being uniform, and the determination of whether a merchant has conformed to reasonable commercial standards would be difficult. At this juncture, it's reasonable to wonder whether these findings too are simply artifacts of a bygone era, and it is to this question that we will turn in our next video.